John, it's a delight to be able to sit here in these beautiful surroundings of Green Templeton College to talk about your latest book, Cosmic Chemistry, Do God and Science Mix? Now, this is actually a book that had its first life in the book God's Undertaker, which I think was probably published nearly 15 years or so ago. Why did you write that book first time round, and what's made you want to revisit it this time round?
Well, for many years I've been interested in the whole question of the relationship between science and the God question. After all, I was a mathematician, and even in school days I was curious, where does mathematics fit into science? And where does science fit into the whole picture of our understanding of the universe? Does it tell us everything, or do we need more? And I had been interacting with the whole science-religion debate since my middle teens. I came across a book by a chemist who taught in the Cambridge Tech called R.E.D. Clark, and he really sparked my mind to start thinking about these things. I was simply fascinated to read a scientist who believed in God and who felt beyond that science was giving evidence of the existence of God. So it started very early. And then, because I was in the university world, I began increasingly to be asked to give talks relating my faith in God to my work in mathematics and so on. And people began to say, you ought to put this in a book. So the pressure grew. And of course, the topic grew. So in the end, I gave in, and I decided to write this book called God's Undertaker, A Science Buried God, which was my first attempt, actually, at a book in this genre.
And I really enjoyed reading it the first time round. Obviously, 15 plus years later on, a lot of water under the bridge. But essentially, do you feel that those issues you were speaking into are still live today, especially the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and others, who were saying God and science don't mix very explicitly?
Yeah, that's right. They were saying it then, and they're still saying it, although perhaps not quite so convincingly now. And what I find is there is enormous interest. I suppose it's unreasonable to judge it just by audience size, but since the lockdown, for example, doing Zoom conferences all over the world, the attendance at them and the questioning is all there. And perhaps it's even more intense than it was before, because people have, with the passage of time, less background in these things.
What were some of the key challenges that you were meeting when you wrote the book first time round and that you addressed today? Specifically, of course, The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins had a huge reception, a best-selling book all over the world, and very much putting the case that God has been defeated, essentially, by scientific progress. What were you meeting, I suppose, in Oxford, obviously, as a contemporary of Richard Dawkins teaching here? Were you finding that kind of view was being expressed in the student body by other academics? Were you meeting it generally when you went around?
Oh, I often heard people say, I'm a Dawkins fan, even if they hadn't read his stuff. And what I found myself doing was taking it seriously. I felt it's very important not to just have a knee-jerk reaction. I don't believe that stuff. But to read what they had to say, take it seriously, analyze it, and see if there was an adequate response to it. And what I discovered, in a way to my amazement, is that some of the intellectual foundations, indeed many of them, of Dawkins-type arguments were very shaky. I mean, you mentioned the book, The God Delusion, and delusion is a psychiatric term. And to my amazement, I discovered that Dawkins, using this concept, had never consulted any leading psychiatrists who disagreed with him profoundly on the idea of God being a delusion. And that old Freudian argument, which he used and felt it really dismissed God, he couldn't see that actually it's a double-edged sword. There's a wonderful psychiatrist in Germany, Alfred Lutz, who wrote a book called A Brief History of the Great One, eine kleine Geschichte des Größten. And he said, if there is no God, then Freud's argument is brilliant. God is a delusion if there is no God. But of course, if there is a God, then atheism is a delusion.
Yeah.
And the point is, the bottom line, which I felt was really important, and I've written about it, is that Freud can't help you when it comes to the question, is there a God or not? And Dawkins had totally bypassed that. And what I found on close investigation was that even atheist writers were getting a little bit upset and even ashamed of the kind of thing that Dawkins wrote, people like Michael Ruse and so on. So I felt it was necessary to clear up what were misunderstandings even of the nature of science, which I was surprised to find in a writer who is a scientist, but also misunderstandings about the nature of God.
Yes.
They were denying the existence of God in whom nobody believed.
And you've done that not only in writing, but in discussion and debate with some of these key names over the years. I remember very well sitting in the Natural History Museum in Oxford when you were on stage with a giant T-Rex towering over yourself and Richard Dawkins, debating some of these issues. Looking back on some of those encounters, what do you think has been the value of those? And what were some of the key arguments and points that were being debated in those?
I think they were very valuable. They were terrifying experiences, of course, especially that particular one, because the difficulty was Dawkins and I had somehow to maintain a conversation without a great deal of direction, which is what he wanted, I believe. But there was a lot of pressure, I felt, in the sense that here you are, and you're representing God in a way, and so you want to get the thing right. And I feel we did get some good arguments, but what I was advised by a very senior newspaper writer in this country, very well-known person, he said, look, make sure when you enter one of these debates that when it's finished, you have said what you want to say. Don't simply be reactive. And that was hugely impressive. And what has encouraged me through the years is that the number of people, again and again, who write to me, who say that was the beginnings of them finding their way to a deep Christian faith. And even on that evening, there was at least one research scientist who started her way to Christianity. So it's the net result. People often say, well, you didn't convert Dawkins. No, although I don't think conversion of people like that is impossible. There was a man called Saul of Tarsus after all. But the point is to do what, to be fair to him, both Dawkins and I wanted to do. Let's get this into the public space. Yeah. And let's trust people to make up their own minds. Let's at least give them the evidence. And I feel with all the mistakes I made, and I have got 20/20 hindsight on it, all the things I could have done better. And the thing I remember so well about that, the Natural History Museum, as I sat under the T-Rex, I suddenly remembered that Oxford Natural History Museum had been built with profits from OUP's sale of Bibles. But I couldn't pinpoint it. And I thought, if I say this, and it was going on in my mind all the time, I may have it wrong. And I knew Dawkins had worked there. So I said it as a question. Wasn't this building dedicated to the glory of God? And so on. He said, absolutely not. And he was wrong, of course. I couldn't find any information in the foyer, no information. So I went into the debate with that one thing that I would so dearly love to have presented there.
Yes, well, benefit of hindsight, isn't it? It's interesting, though, because the Natural History Museum is essentially designed on the model of a classic Gothic church, isn't it?
Yes.
So it's almost a temple to science, and to some extent represents what Dawkins and co. have said, which is science has replaced God as an explanation. And indeed, their contention is that if religion, and Christianity specifically, has done anything, it's slowed the progress of science and our understanding of the world and the universe. What's your response to that obvious sort of objection to Christianity?
Well, I like quoting the venerable Richard Swinburne, who's one of our top philosophers. He says, science explains. I postulate God to explain why science explains. I think the point is, use the term science as explanation. And one of the things I do in my book is to really tease out, what do we mean by explanation? And what I fear, and I know, in fact, from reading them, that many of the so-called new atheists, who are now geriatric atheists, think is that God explanation and the scientific explanation are essentially the same, and therefore they compete. And I often say that is making a category mistake, because the science explanation is really dealing with the how, or the why of function, if you like. Why is that bit here, not there? Whereas the God explanation deals with the ultimate meaning and purpose. And I often say, look, God no more competes with science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as an explanation of the motor car. They are complementary explanations. And what fascinates me is sometimes when I'm in schools, I put this to kids. Here are two explanations of the motor car, Henry Ford and the laws of physics and internal combustion. And I say, choose, which is the true explanation? But, sir, you need both. Why Dawkins cannot see that. But if you insist in saying that God is the same kind of explanation, then, of course, there's an inevitable but totally unnecessary clash. And even worse, I discovered, and I've written quite a lot about this, that if you think that God is a kind of gap, God of the gaps, I can't explain it, therefore God did it. So that God takes over where science leaves off, and as science advances, God gets completely squeezed out. Now, of course, if you define God to be a God of the gaps in this way, of course he's in conflict with science by definition. But God is not a God of the gaps, he's God of the whole show, of the bits we can explain and of the bits we can't explain. So when Newton, for example, discovered his law of gravitation and wrote to Bentley that he thought his work might be a pointer towards a divine intelligence, he didn't say, certainly didn't, of course, say, I've got a law of gravitation, I don't need God. No, he said, what a brilliant God who did it that way. And it's that ability to see that God is the God of the whole show. I often say to audiences, have you ever noticed the first sentence in the Bible? In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand. Which, of course, is nonsense. But that is the kind of God that Dawkins was projecting. And that God is a delusion.
Let's talk about the doctrine of creation, because there's an interesting point in the book where you say, far from hindering the progress of science, the Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation actually spurred it on. Can you explain how that's so?
Yes, that has been one of the most interesting things for me. I got to know John Hedley Brooke in Oxford, who was the first professor of science and religion, and he was a consummate historian, a brilliant historian of science, and he taught me that one of the most important approaches to this whole debate is from the historical perspective. That sets things in order. And one of the most interesting questions posed by historians of science is, they noticed, it's very easy to see, that the pioneers, let's think of Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, Babbage, Faraday, all of these people, Boyle, were believers in God. And they represent the peak of the explosion of what we would call modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries. And so they naturally asked the question, is there any relation between the two? And some of the greatest thinkers, particularly Sir Alfred North Whitehead, came to the conclusion, yes, there's a deep connection. It's to do with the medieval belief in God, as Whitehead said. And Lewis, C.S. Lewis, whom I'm old enough to remember actually lecturing, he made a very powerful point, I think, summing up Whitehead's work. He said, men became scientific. Sadly, there were no women scientists in those days. We've redressed that balance. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. In other words, there's a deep connection, and I often put it provocatively that I am not remotely ashamed of being both a scientist of sorts and a believer in God, because arguably it was the Judeo-Christian tradition that gave me my subject. And Nobel Prize winners like Melvin Calvin, he said, you know, what is the origin of this conviction that there's order in the universe? He said, I find it in the Hebrew tradition going back thousands of years. And that is the basis for the rise of modern science. And it's not only that, because it's arguable from the biblical perspective that it teaches that the universe is contingent. That is, it could have been otherwise. And so if you want to find out what it's like, you go and look. Now, one of the biggest moves in the history of science came when Kepler abandoned the thinking that had dominated European science for millennia, actually, of Aristotle, which was you start with philosophical principles, you apply them to the universe. In other words, you have a concept of perfection. Perfect motion is circular. So you've got to discover that the perfect motions of the perfect planets and stars beyond the moon must be circular. You try circles, they don't work. Then you put circles upon circles upon circles, epicycles and so on. And Kepler, in an utterly revolutionary step, said, why don't we just go and look and see what it's like? And he very soon came to the conclusion that the planets move in ellipses, equally perfect with sun as focus. And it's that idea which is thoroughly biblical, together with the doctrine of creation. And where the doctrine of creation comes in, of course, is the obvious one. There was a beginning. And science has confirmed that since those early days. And it raises the question of a cause. And therefore, as a pretty obvious inference to a best explanation, you have God as cause being a very highly plausible explanation of the existence of the universe, compared with the kind of explanation I've had in more recent years to face coming from the likes of Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss.
And yet many people are ignorant of the Judeo-Christian origins of modern science, the ways that many of those great scientists were believers and saw their faith as consistent with and actually, compelled by. But yet, the conflict narrative still persists, especially from those new atheist writers. And you're more likely to hear about some conflict between Galileo and the church and the way the church stood in the way of, scientific progress. What do you do with those kinds of stories?
Well, I analyze them. It's very interesting. Years ago, I was invited to give the very first lecture on this kind of topic in the University of Novosibirsk in Siberia. And I had an audience. The front row looked to me to consist of KGB colonels, really. And the talk was, a mathematician explains why he believes in God. And I related this fact about Galileo and Kepler and so on. And I noticed a frostiness settling over the audience, and they got angry. And I don't like angry audiences, so I stopped. And addressing the rather prominent-looking figure in the middle, I said, excuse me, but you look angry. Why are you angry? And he stood up and he said, of course I'm angry. Why weren't we told before that these men believed in God? And I started to laugh, actually. I said, can't you guess? It didn't fit in with the atheism that has been behind your culture. And they didn't know that these early pioneers believed in God. But the very interesting thing is the one you now bring up, is that one of those pioneers, particularly Galileo, has often been used to push what we now call the conflict narrative, that science and God are incompatible. And I'm indebted to people like John Brooke and others who've analyzed this in detail. Now, John's a very careful historian, but he comes out with a conclusion that would concur with many others, that the Galileo story cannot be used to drive a conflict metaphor. First of all, Galileo was no atheist challenging the ignoramuses in the Roman Catholic Church. Galileo was a believer in God when he started, and he was a believer in God when he finished. And the things that irritated people about Galileo, and there were many, we'll come to those in a moment, but I think the key issue with Galileo was there he was in the name of science, and he was questioning what was established wisdom. Not for the church, yes. Why? Because they had got on the bandwagon of Aristotle, the view that the earth was the center and it didn't move. And the fact is that the first people that challenged Galileo, as I understand from having read most of the literature on it, was not the church at all, but the philosophers. They were against it. So it was a conflict about worldview. And the church had jumped on the bandwagon because they felt the Bible would support that worldview, that the earth didn't move, that sun moved, but the earth didn't move. And they later reversed that, of course. So that to regard that as God versus science is false. The second thing is that Galileo insisted on writing in Italian rather than in Latin. And that irritated people, but not so much as when he wrote his famous book, he put the views of the then Pope, who had been his friend, into the words of a character called Simplicio, the fool. And of course, for PR, that was an absolute disaster. And you know, if you read Davos Sabel's wonderful book, Galileo's Daughter, you'll see that there's just no evidence that Galileo was a non-believer. There was a professor of the history of science, Colin Russell, at the Open University. He once wrote a very interesting piece where he said this conflict myth is so against history that the thing that needs to be explained is where it possibly could have come from. Galileo certainly can be used for it, and neither can the famous debate that took place in the Natural History Museum, where the aforementioned debate between Dawkins and myself took place, between Bishop Wilberforce and Thomas Henry Huxley.
But why did that sort of anti-religious, pro-science conflict narrative emerge then around, I suppose, especially around the time of Huxley and co? There was a sense in which, was it a feeling that Darwinism now needed to trump any idea of design in biology? What was going on?
I think this is a very complex thing. It's a very interesting thing, because you have, going back further, you have Newton and his wonderful laws that led people to think that the universe is like a great machine and that is determined to run on these fixed laws. And that tended to push God right to the background, to a kind of deism. God started it, the machine is like clockwork, it's ticking away. And of course, inevitably, especially with the rise of the French intellectuals and the Enlightenment in France, where they discovered that the best way of disagreeing with people was cut their heads off and you stop the disagreement, was an incipient atheism that was fueled massively by a corrupt church. So a lot of sociological factors were playing there. But then there was the rise of an elite of scientists, of whom Huxley was one. He was dead against these amateur clergymen who sat in lovely benefices out in the country in Oxfordshire here and studied butterflies and worms and this kind of stuff. Some of them were very learned people, you see, and Wilberforce was one of those. But Huxley wanted a professional scientific elite. He wanted to turn the churches into temples to the goddess of wisdom, Sophia, and all this kind of thing. And so he pushed that end. And the debate with Wilberforce was skewed in terms of reportage really by Huxley and his friends. Now, I have read the whole of what Wilberforce wrote, and the amazing thing is that Wilberforce himself states that he is not going to argue against Darwin on the basis of the Christian worldview. That's what he explicitly refuses to do. He said, I'm going to do it on the basis of science. And Darwin's comment was, he has uncommonly cleverly pointed out some of the weaknesses in my theory. So reports, there are very few that exist, and they say that they roughly had equals in what they did. But again, Colin Russell, in his article, says you cannot use this to drive a conflict narrative. Far more complex than that. And very much Huxley was driving, let's get rid of these amateur vicars who were scientists.
But many of the modern inheritors of that scientistic view that Huxley embodied, people like Richard Dawkins, Peter Atkins today, they would say it's the progress of science, what we know about the universe, that makes us believe that actually it's pointing towards atheism, towards naturalism, rather than towards God. So why do they see this conflict narrative as being alive and well today when it comes to science and God?
I think one of the reasons is they don't study history enough, because if they did, they would know that between 1900 and 2000, over 65% of all Nobel Prize winners did believe in God. It's a bit of an exaggeration. And I think it's important. Of course, we don't settle these things by statistics, but it's important to analyze what is going on, because the underlying message of a lot of this is what we call scientism. Science is the only way to truth, and you better get used to it. And Dawkins and the late Stephen Hawking are both very strongly on that side. Now, that is plainly incorrect. I love logic as a mathematician, and the statement, science is the only way to truth, is not a statement of science, it's a statement of philosophical belief. And therefore, if science is the only way to truth, if it's true, it's false. So it's logically incoherent. And oddly, one of Dawkins' great scientific heroes, and one of mine, is Peter Medawar, who was here in Oxford, won the Nobel Prize. And one of the points he made is something that needs to be brought into the center of the discussion. That is, science is wonderful, but it has its limits. And Medawar says we're doing science no service at all if we claim that it can answer every question. It cannot even answer what he calls Karl Popper's questions, the questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? And what is the meaning of life? And he says we've got to turn to literature and so on, and philosophy for answers to these questions. The realization that science, though powerful, and I'm talking, of course, about the natural sciences, is limited, is hugely important, because that would shift one away from the kind of statement of Hawking and Dawkins that science is going to explain everything there is to know about the universe. Einstein put his finger on part of it beautifully when he said, you can talk about the ethical foundations of science, but you cannot talk about the scientific foundations of ethics. And indeed, I think it was Schrödinger, the Nobel Prize-winning quantum scientist, who said, it's amazing how little science tells us about the things that really matter. And certainly it doesn't give us any answer to what most people, thinking people, are looking for. And that is the question of meaning in their lives. But I detect also an element, not simply of atheism, but actually anti-theism among many of these scientists. Think of Nobel Prize winner Stephen Weinberg. We got to wake up from the nightmare of religion, and anything scientists can do to eliminate religion ought to be done, which is seriously totalitarian. Now, we've got to face that. Certainly there have been religions that have damaged humanity, and they must speak for themselves. But the only one I can speak for is the Christian one, where Christ himself told his disciples not to get involved in physical fighting and all this kind of stuff, and defended the attitude that is open to reason and thinking and thought. So part of my book is devoted to dealing with this kind of scientism. Now, there's another conviction that underlines this, and it's what we might call ontological reductionism. That is explanation. What is explanation? Explanation means explaining something complex in terms of simpler bits. So it is bottom up, so to speak. In other words, you're reducing the complex to the simple. So bottom up, but not top down. And that conviction underlines this, and Dawkins puts it very neatly and helps us understand what's going on. He said, look, if you're going to introduce God as an explanation of anything, that is absurd. Why? Because God, by definition, is more complex than the thing you're explaining, and therefore God is no explanation at all. Now, that sounds terrific until you analyze it in Dawkins' own case. I pick up a book, The God Delusion, 400 pages? And I ask for an explanation of its origin. And I'm told it originates in the vastly more complex mind of Richard Dawkins. And I say that cannot be true, because your explanation is more complex than the thing that you're explaining. Surely your idea of Richard Dawkins is a Dawkins of the gaps. You simply can't explain it. So you're postulating a Dawkins of the gaps. Now, the serious point of the analogy is this, that yes, wonderful if we can reduce complex things to more simple parts, water to hydrogen, oxygen, and so on. That kind of reductionism is very useful. We do it all the time, but there's one place where it fails, and that is where language is involved, meaningful language. And that's why Dawkins' book raises that question. Now, it's very interesting to see where atheist attitudes go with one of the basic things that are involved in science. I often ask colleagues when I meet them, what do you do science with? And they say, with my, and they almost say mind, but if they're very up to date, they say brain, because they believe the brain is the mind, as you know. I say, okay, let's have the brain. Give me a brief history of the brain. Well, they say, it's very simple. The brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I usually sit back, pause for a minute, and smile and say, and you trust it? Now tell me honestly, and here's a fascinating experiment. You tell me honestly whether, if you knew that the computer that you use every day was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you use it? I've always had the answer, no. So I say, I see you have a problem. You're telling me that you trust your brain or your mind to do science, but yet your elucidation of the instrument, if you like, with which you do science undermines any vestige of confidence in the rationality you need to do the science. Now, what's so interesting about that, Justin, is that is an argument that's been around for a long time. C.S. Lewis uses it, Alvin Plantinga, but now, in more recent days, Thomas Nagel, who's a brilliant atheist philosopher, says there's something basically wrong with this materialistic, naturalistic view of origins, because they undermine the rationality we need to do science. Now, he wants to come up with a materialistic solution. He hasn't found it. And that doesn't surprise me. So what I'm saying here is, when you unpack this seemingly impregnable edifice of saying science leads to atheism, the very thinking that is involved in doing science, if you presuppose atheism, undermines all rationality. And it was Lewis who said, any theory that undermines thinking cannot by definition be true, because you have to think to get to it. So I see huge flaws here, but the trouble is, the difficulty is in articulating these things to the public and point out the emperor actually has no clothes. And that's a difficulty that faces me.
I mean, when it comes to this question of what is it appropriate for science to explain, and what actually is beyond the explanation of science, what do we need other tools to investigate the world with? You make a very good analogy in the book with the idea of someone baking a cake.
Aunt Matilda.
Yeah, Aunt Matilda's cake. Tell us about Aunt Matilda's cake.
Yes, well, that illustrates the limits of science. Here we have Aunt Matilda. She's baked a cake, and we have all the Nobel Prize winners assembled, and we ask them to tell us about the cake. So we get very detailed explanations of its biochemistry, of the basic physics behind it, of metabolic pathways, and all this kind of thing. And when they've all finished, I say, well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Now tell us why she made it. And she starts to grin, because of course she knows why. And the point is that their scientific analysis cannot answer the question, but she can. She can reveal it to us. Now, this is an innocent little analogy, but actually it serves a very much bigger purpose. That when she reveals it and says, I made it for my cousin Jimmy's birthday, we don't shut off our rational assessment of that. If she doesn't have a cousin Jimmy, then we'll not believe her. The point is, science can deal with many things about that cake and deal with them rationally. But, and here's the problem with scientism, science is not coextensive with rationality. And when she reveals it to us, we use our rationality to assess that revelation. Now, on a much bigger scale, going back to the father of science, Francis Bacon, and his idea that God has two books, the book of nature and the Bible, the book of God's Word. We use our rationality to cope with both. And I like to say to people, look, we have two sources of information. We've got the natural world and we've got the biblical worldview. But we use our rationality in both. We use evidence-based thinking on both. And that's what I'm pleading for. But then I run up against this, that one of the drivers of these atheist convictions is the idea, let me quote Hitchens, atheists have no faith. You see, they think that faith is a religious word, and it means believing where there's no evidence. They're wrong on both counts, and seriously wrong. And what they do not realize, and I find it almost impossible to get across, even to some of my colleagues here in Oxford, and that is that faith is an ordinary word, which we all use. It comes from Latin fides. We get fidelity, trust. All those words are related. And whenever we're asked to have faith in something, or a bank manager, we ask him to have faith in us and give us a loan, evidence is the first thing we think about. What is the evidence that you can pay me back? Evidence-based faith, we all know about it. And yet, if you say, no, faith is believing where there's no evidence, and that's the religious bit, what you do is make a gigantic mistake. First of all, you're saying there's no evidence for the truth of Christianity, which I would strongly disagree with. But secondly, you're saying, and this is perhaps just as dangerous, that faith is not involved in science. When, of course, it is. I've just given you an example of it. Scientists trust their minds. They are believers, but they trust more than that. They trust that this universe is accessible to the human mind, that is rationally intelligible.
And that's one of the extraordinary things, is that even among non-Christians and great physicists like Sir Roger Penrose, recently won a Nobel Prize himself, he has pushed against the naturalist assumptions, actually, of Dawkins and others in his field, because he recognizes that it's extraordinary that the maths that he does and the physics he enjoys maps onto this physical universe. And he hasn't, as far as I can see, yet worked out exactly why that is, why there is this incredible congruence, the fact that we can use science and maths to map out the physical world. Now, most people just take that for granted. It's almost, nobody almost thinks about that. But increasingly, I think this has been coming up in the scientific community. Why is there this ability to do science in the first place? And for you, in the book, John, you say, actually, this is an important clue towards God. and away from this naturalist perspective that many of these scientists adopt.
Hugely important, I think. And it's been noticed for a long, long time. Because if you go back to Galileo and Newton and so on, what was their motive for doing science? They believed it could be done. They believed there was order there. Why? Because they believed, as Lewis says in that quote I made earlier, they believed in a lawgiver, a legislator. And it was that underlying conviction that there's order that Melvin Calvin, whom I mentioned earlier, believed came from the Judeo-Christian tradition. In other words, all scientists are people of faith. Faith in what? Not necessarily in God, though many of them are. But all of us have to believe before we start our science that science can be done, or the universe is rationally intelligible, or more precisely, the universe is mathematically intelligible. Now, in 1961, Eugene Wigner, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics, wrote a wonderful paper called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. And I was very, very interested in this. On what assumption is mathematics unreasonable? Well, certainly it's unreasonable on atheistic assumptions. Very unreasonable indeed. You've no right to accept it, expect it, as many scientists have pointed out. But on the assumption that there is a God who created the world and ordered it, then it's perfectly reasonable that mathematics works. And I often say, look, isn't it amazing that here's a mathematician, she's thinking in here, and she comes up with an equation and applies to the motion of an exoplanet out there, say. How does that possibly work? Well, it works because the universe out there and the mind in here, so to speak, are both the products of an intelligent creator. That makes sense. But as we've already seen, once you remove the intelligent creator, you're left to a faith that has no base in evidence. Now, here's the irony, you see. The irony is not that there's a conflict between God and science. There isn't. But there is a conflict between science and atheism. For that very reason, it undermines the rational underpinnings that we need to do science. Now, I say this is important because, first of all, it's absolutely central, and secondly, everybody can understand it.
You've spoken about the intelligibility of the universe, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, and the way that is very coherent when it comes to a theistic outlook on the world. What about the actual results of science? Because obviously what a lot of people are interested in are some of the things like Big Bang cosmology, this idea that there was a beginning, physical beginning to the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe where the parameters and numbers of the physics themselves and the laws seem so exquisitely finely tuned to allow life to develop in the cosmos. To what extent do you think Christians can use those kinds of physical discoveries to build a case for a mind behind the universe?
To a very great extent, because our atheist friends see there is a problem. Take the Big Bang first. Of course, Fred Hoyle coined that phrase, Big Bang. It was a label on a mystery. It was his rejection, really, and repugnance to the idea of a beginning. And part of that, his colleagues said, was he didn't really like the idea of a creator. Now, what is so interesting about that is that I remember the 1960s when the evidence came in strong and heavy that there was a beginning to space-time. It was resisted in the UK, even by the editor of Nature, who said we shouldn't go down that road because it'll give too much leverage to people who believe in creation. In other words, it raised the obvious question, if there was a beginning to space-time, and everything we know this universe proceeded from that point, it raises the question, what caused it? What lies behind it? Now, oddly enough, it was the 1960s where we had the definitive evidence came in. For centuries, it had been believed with Aristotle that the universe was eternal. But the Hebrew Bible had, for centuries, and the Christian New Testament had been claiming that there was a beginning. And they were proved to be right. And when I mentioned this in a debate with Dawkins, he said, what's the big deal? There either was a beginning and there wasn't. So if you guess, you've got a 50% chance of getting it right. I said, Richard, it wasn't decided by statistics or tossing a coin. It was decided against enormous pressure. And a lot of the pressure coming from atheism, that it couldn't be so. So to be able to say initially, as you say, the pushback against the idea that there was a beginning to space-time actually did come primarily from atheist scientists. And they had to give in because of the sheer weight of evidence. So Dawkins was wrong when he suggested to me that it was the toss of a coin. And I have made the point repeatedly, at least the Bible got it right all those millennia ago. And so we have a beginning. It raises the question of, well, what caused that? The cosmologists, brilliant people like the late Stephen Hawking, come in to try to explain how you can get something from nothing. This is the key philosophical question. It goes back to Leibniz and Heidegger and all kinds of other people. How do you get something for nothing? And his key statement in his penultimate book is, because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, when I read that, I thought, pardon? Because there is a law like gravity, because there's something, the universe will create itself from nothing. That's a flat logical contradiction. But then, on inquiring a bit further, I noticed, well, because there's a law like gravity, is this falling for the common mistake among scientists that laws create things? C.S. Lewis debunked that long ago when pointing out that the laws of arithmetic won't create any money for you, even though some experts in the banking world thought it could. And then finally, the universe will create itself. Well, what does that mean? Just analyzing the words. If I say X creates Y, it means if you've got X, you're going to get Y, roughly speaking. If I say X creates X, well, as I said in my book, it means nonsense remains nonsense, even if high-powered scientists talk it. Now, that profoundly disturbed me. If this is the way you get rid of God, then it is intellectually unworthy. And think of Lawrence Krauss in his book, A Universe from Nothing, where he says near the beginning, he says, surely nothing must be physical, just as something is, even if it is the absence of something. Well, that's just sheer rubbish. Now, if people to get rid of God have to resort to rubbish, then using inference, the best explanation, the God explanation comes off very much more effectively. It really does worry me, that kind of non-explanation that is being foisted on people today. So there's a huge question. Hawking has not solved the question of why there's something rather than nothing. And what I want to say very carefully is, the universe came from nothing physical, but it didn't come from nothing. It came from God, who's not nothing. God may be spirit, but he isn't nothing. And therefore, again, the biblical worldview comes in with an explanation that makes sense. Now, I've mentioned once or twice in the course of this chat, inference to the best explanation. You see, science has got several ways of explaining things, and one of them is inductive explanation. That is where you do a lot of experiments, you can repeat them, and you come to a conclusion, and you expect to happen tomorrow what happened yesterday, and so on. But there's lots of fascinating things in the universe that are not repeated, like the origin of the universe, or the origin of life. And there you have to use inference to the best explanation. In other words, the methods of the historian or forensic scientist. Hercule Poirot cannot say, well, let's see what happened. Let's repeat the murder and we can see exactly what happened. You can't do that. So he has to use inference. Now, if A did the murder, you'd expect X to happen. X happened. But then Y has happened, and that excludes A. But if B did the murder, both X and Y would happen. So that B is a more plausible candidate, and so you make an inference to the best explanation, and that's the secret of Agatha Christie's denouements.
And that's the sort of explanation that you might then be tempted to give for a phenomenon like the fine-tuning of the universe for life. So
absolutely,
these extraordinary physical constants and laws that seem so precisely balanced in a way that allows life to develop in the cosmos. Give us an example, firstly, of these types of laws, and then why you think it's valid to use an explanation such as a designer.
Well, Paul Davies, a physicist who I know and is always worth reading, has got a whole array of these. And one of them is, if you consider the ratio of the electromagnetic force constant to the gravitational force constant, if you decrease that just by the slightest 1 part in 10 to the power 40, that's a 1 with 40 zeros at it, then you will only get large stars. If you increase it by 1 part in 10 to the 40, you'll only get little stars. But in order to have carbon-based life, you must have both big stars and little stars. So the fine-tuning has to be unbelievably precise. And there are even more significant examples given by Roger Penrose, who one of his fine-tuning arguments is that if you want to have a universe with a second law of dynamics, in other words, one in which a car will rust eventually, disorder increases, the creator's aim, and he uses that word, he doesn't believe in a creator, must be accurate to 1 part in 10 to the power 10 to the power 123, which number, as he points out, is so big that if you put a 1 here and a 0 in every elementary particle in the universe, you can't even write it out in decimal basis. So this is a huge thing. It demands explanation. There's a very eminent philosopher here in Oxford, and he invited me to be grilled by his students and talk to them about why I believed in God. And he said, I hope you're going to use the best argument against atheism. I said, well, I'd use it if you tell me what it is. Oh, he said, if ever I were to become a Christian, it would be the fine-tuning argument. He said, that really does have bite. And so it's not that I'm sitting here as a Christian saying, look, you guys ought to think about this. They are thinking about it. It's part of standard science now. This is not some peripheral little thing. It is hardcore mainstream science, and it raises a huge question. Now, I'm well aware that the way out of it for many scientists, like our astronomer royal, Lord Rees, is to say that there is a multiverse. There are infinitely many universes, and so you'd expect, if that's the case, there to be one like this. But there's no evidence for these universes. And I may be prejudiced, but I was taught quantum physics years ago at Cambridge by Sir John Polkinghorne. And he just says these are not accessible to us. And he feels, even on the basis of the principle of economy of explanation, that one universe that has been designed and created by an intelligent creator is infinitely to be preferred to an infinite collection of universes to which we've no access. But I would add that philosophers have been quick to point out that it's not either fine-tuning shows there's a God or there's a multiverse. God can create as many multiverses as he likes, so the multiverse hypothesis does not get rid of God.
The natural response may be, yes, John, that's all very well, but God is a sort of science stopper as an explanation. I can't investigate God, therefore, I don't want that to be the final explanation. And in any case, the more we do learn about the fine-tuning of the universe, it's likely that we will eventually find some naturalistic explanation. And it's just another God of the gaps argument. God will eventually get squeezed out of this particular argument. I mean, what's your response to that idea that it's just more God of the gaps thinking?
Well, the point is that by discovering the fine-tuning, we are investigating God. We're investigating, the biblical statement, the heavens declare the glory of God. And I made the point earlier, God is the God of the whole show. Henry Ford isn't going to be found in researching the inner workings of a car engine, but you cannot explain its existence without him. What we're dealing with is a complementary approach. We're asking a bigger question. the science gives us the how and part of the why of function. It doesn't give us the ultimate purpose or the ultimate origin. And what these things are doing, like fine-tuning, they're pointing towards something. They're pointing beyond themselves. And what I want to ask is it a reasonable inference to a best explanation to postulate a God who's ultimately responsible for the complexity of this nature, or to postulate mindless, impersonal forces? And when I see that the atheistic explanation runs into the sand at the very first hurdle, that is explaining our trust in human intelligence to sort the thing out, then, of course, I feel that it's much better to go for an explanation that makes sense than one that makes no sense whatsoever.
Having talked about fine-tuning at the cosmological level, you also say there's a case for fine-tuning at the biological level. This perhaps is a more controversial claim because, in a sense, it's almost been regarded as sacrosanct, the idea that Darwin showed us, categorically that there's no need anymore to think of design in biology, that evolution, the principle of mutation and selection, provide all we need to show the way that the diversity and apparent complexity and designed aspect of life wasn't in fact designed. Richard Dawkins has written many books essentially making this same point over and over. Why do you think the issue of design in biology isn't actually over?
Oh, it's not over for many, many reasons. But to come to the actual business of fine-tuning, there are two Norwegians, I think it's Steinar Thorvaldsen and Ola Høsjer, brilliant statisticians who have been working in the biological field. And they've just recently written a paper pointing out that there is strong evidence of fine-tuning in the organic world. Now, they say this is very early stages and there'd be a lot to be done. And I think Alistair McGrath has been making hints in this direction. And Marcus Eberlin, a brilliant Brazilian biologist, has written a book called Foresight. And he looks at the sheer complexity and the nature of that complexity of biological mechanisms and says they exhibit a characteristic of mind that is not possessed by natural processes, and that is foresight. And this is a very interesting development. So I see this as a field that will burgeon out as we see, and we see the following, that Richard Dawkins' assessment of how life came to be and how it developed is increasingly turning out to be seen as very naive, if not completely false. Now, let me say something about that. I have here, because I don't want to misquote it, the famous statement in The Blind Watchmaker, where he says, natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind, it has no mind and no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future, it has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is that of the blind watchmaker. Now that's marvelous writing. The rhetoric is terrific, but it's nonsense. Because if you analyze it, the first thing you notice is that it's not a sleight of hand, it's a sleight of rhetoric. You see, blind automatic process, that makes you think it hasn't been designed. But wait a minute, I have a self-winding watch. It's blind, it's automatic, so it hasn't been designed. No, it has been designed. In other words, where Dawkins is saying this mechanism has no mind, what he is dodging is the question everybody wants to ask, but is there a mind behind it? That's a totally different question. And he hasn't even dealt with that question. So that's my first point, which is why, of course, there are many people around the world today who think that Darwin essentially got it right, that evolution is a process that God used, they called it theistic evolution, to develop all the varieties of life. And clearly, to a certain extent, that is true, because we can observe the kind of thing that Dawkins, that Darwin observed in his day. I'll come to that later because I have questions to ask. But before we even go down that route, concealed in this famous statement of Dawkins is a huge mistake that he had later admitted. Because look at what it says. We now know that this is the explanation for the existence of life. Do we? No. Darwin's natural selection and mutation, which Darwin knew nothing about, of course, is not an explanation for the existence of life for a very simple reason. Whatever natural selection does or doesn't do, it depends on life to do anything, so it cannot explain life. Now, it took Dawkins years from writing that to admitting in one of his more recent books that evolutionary theories, Darwin's theory, does not deal with the origin of life. Now, that is hugely important because this simply drew the wool over people's eyes. Clearly, evolutionary processes are there. We all look different. There is variation. Darwin saw it in finch beaks and all this kind of thing. But however far that reaches, and I think there may well be a limit, and that is being admitted by many biologists today, where it wasn't in the day that Dawkins wrote this book. They think that the neo-Darwinian synthesis, in the words of the systems biologist Dennis Noble, who's a fellow of the Royal Society here in Oxford, doesn't need to be modified, it needs to be replaced. It's inadequate. But leaving that aside, we have the fact that life exists, and this claim of Dawkins that permeates the whole of society, that evolution is the answer, is simply false. And I feel that it's very important to tell the public that. I mean, Dawkins' argument that numerous small accumulations of mutations are going to do it. Well, just listen to this. There's a Third Way website, the Third Way of Evolution, operated by people like Dennis Noble and James Shapiro. Quote, "The DNA record does not support the assertion that small random mutations are the main source of new and useful variations. We now know that the many different processes of variation involve well-regulated cell action on DNA molecules." Well, where is Dawkins' gradualistic view? Gone. But the public don't know that, Justin. And one of the reasons I decided to rewrite this book totally was to bring to public attention what serious biologists are doing they haven't got rid of Darwin completely, but it looks as if they're getting very near to it. In other words, the mechanisms postulated in that statement for Dawkins, A, have nothing to do with the origin of life, and B, have relatively little to do with the variation of life. So now the subject is absolutely burgeoning. And one of the most interesting things to me as a mathematician is not so much the variation, but it's the origin. Because what we now know, that Darwin didn't know, is that fundamental to all life is the longest word we've ever discovered, the DNA, the human genome, which is a word in 4 chemical letters, and it's 3.5 billion letters long. It's a word-based biology. Now, this is what I love about what's going on in this topic. We've been talking about the effectiveness of mathematics. That is, we can describe some of what's going on in the universe out there by using the language of mathematics, mathematical words, and some of it is extremely sophisticated. But now in biology, we're finding something very similar. It's a word-based universe in terms of mathematics. Now we're discovering that genetics is word-based, so life is word-based. Now, putting a Christian hat on, that resonates utterly brilliantly with the initial statement of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos. All things came to be through him, which resonates with the first statement in Genesis. And God said, let there be light. It's a word-based universe. So what's happening? It seems to me that within biology, whatever mechanisms are involved, and whatever the level of God's involvement, so to speak, direct rather than indirect, the whole thing, the way in which it operates and what it is pointing towards that intelligent word base.
And when it comes to this extraordinary code that we find in nature, the DNA molecule, that code that needed to be there before any purported process of evolution took place to allow life in all its variety, for you, I suppose as a mathematician and perhaps as much as an engineer as well in some ways, you see all around you that those kinds of codes, those kinds of structures need information. They don't simply arise by themselves. And as far as you can see, the science is dead against that idea of a kind of this piecemeal accumulation.
Oh, absolutely. The point is they don't need information. They carry information. DNA is an information-bearing macromolecule. And it is giving the blueprint for proteins, which are vastly complicated machines. And, I really knew very little before I started studying this, that you take a single cell, contains maybe 100 million proteins of 20,000 different types. And it's so small that a couple of hundred could be placed on a dot and an I in a typescript. The tiniest bacterial cell, how much does it weigh? Less than a trillionth of a gram. And it's got thousands of molecular machines, 100,000 million atoms, 100 billion atoms in the tiniest bacterial cell. It's absolutely without parallel in the non-living world. In other words, it's not that it's complex, it's the nature of the complexity. And we're back to Richard Dawkins as an explanation for his own book. Dawkins' book is not the length of the human genome. And yet we unflinchingly postulate his mind as responsible for that book. So I often say to people, you look up in a room and you see exit. That's 4 letters. And you immediately know that whatever mechanical processes, manufacturing processes, robotic processes, automatic processes are involved in its construction, there was a mind behind it. Immediately, 4 letters. And yet people sit in front of the DNA with its 3.5 billion letters and they say, chance and necessity. That, to my mind, is completely absurd as an inference to the best explanation.
And in that sense, as you've said in the book, the conflict isn't between science and God. It is between these two worldviews that people bring to the science, the theism and the atheism. And as far as you can see, actually, there's plenty more evidence supporting a theistic perspective, that there is a mind that makes sense of this extraordinary complexity and intelligibility than it is all just the result of blind, purposeless processes.
Yes. You see, DNA in itself is enough for me. In the beginning was the Word. But what has been unraveled, particularly by the systems biologists like Dennis Noble in recent years, is there's a whole epigenetic level, control mechanisms above and beyond. There's information in the Word, but then proteins that are specified by the DNA fold into 3-dimensional shapes, a problem that has just been solved in the last couple of months by artificial intelligence. That carries a lot of information. And so there's level upon level upon level. And of course, what that is doing is pushing atheism into the background so that atheism becomes increasingly an atheism of the gaps.
Interesting. As we conclude, John, the subtitle of the book, it's called Cosmic Chemistry. The subtitle is Do God and Science Mix? In a nutshell, why do you think a reader can go away from this, whether they be Christian or non-Christian, confident that actually they don't just mix, they're dependent upon each other in some way?
I wrote the book in order to present both sides of a case, really, because I've taken the atheist case, if I put it that way, extremely seriously. What I wish to do is not to make people's minds up for them, but to give them insight into what is really going on at the highest levels as best as I can in this debate, so that they get a hold of certain basic things, so that they understand the caricatures of God that have been used to reject God, a delusory God, so that they can understand the nature of scientific thinking, so that they're not fooled by not understanding what explanation is. And I have brought that evidence to bear, and I put it before them, and I say, make up your own mind. I think behind it all is the desire that so often people reject things that they don't like without considering them. And from a Christian perspective, I want to say, look, before you reject it, make sure you know why you're doing that. And read the evidence. I've tried to be fair to it. I've read these people. I've interacted with them all of my life. And so to speak, this is my word to point out that when it's all assessed, I find that the explanation that makes most sense to me is, in the beginning was the Word. And I hope that perhaps people coming to see that may begin to see there might be reason to think about the bigger thing, and that is that the Word became human and lived among us. But that's a story for another time.
Thank you very much for talking to me, John.
Thank you.